mynews.studio.
Picture this: the sun rising over Dubai, world leaders gathered and deep in conversation. Was this finally the moment when fossil fuels would be called out directly as the problem?
Today's date is November 10th, 2025. If we look back nearly 2 years, at COP28 in Dubai, close to 200 countries faced a question that had been avoided at climate talks for decades. Would they finally address fossil fuels as the main cause of climate change?
For years, these conferences seemed to sidestep the topic, didn't they? Lots of careful wording, small steps, but never actually naming fossil fuels. What shifted at COP28?
There was a real sense of urgency this time. New scientific reports were showing all-time high temperatures and more frequent climate disasters. The debate got pretty intense. Should countries commit to phasing down or phasing out fossil fuels?
And after long negotiations, they did reach consensus. The final agreement specifically urges countries to transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems. That's the first time the language at COP has been so direct.
That's a real change. The agreement also sets a global goal of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. There are interim targets too, like tripling renewable energy capacity and doubling energy efficiency by 2030.
But how much weight does this carry? Is there any enforcement if countries don't follow through?
That's the key issue. The deal isn't legally binding. Instead, countries are supposed to show progress through something called the Global Stocktake process. Basically, they submit updated climate plans and emissions data every 5 years.
And those reports, are they made public? So there's transparency, but no real penalties if a country misses its targets.
Exactly. It's about peer pressure, public scrutiny, and international reviews. But there's no official enforcement. Critics argue that a lot then depends on political will.
Let's turn to the people most affected. What provisions are there for workers and communities whose jobs rely on fossil fuels?
The agreement stresses the need for a just, orderly, and equitable transition. It talks about social protections, retraining, and economic diversification. But it leaves the details up to individual countries.
So no global fund or universal framework for workers? Some places, like the EU, have their own support programs, but nothing required for everyone.
That's right. Labor groups and climate justice advocates see this as a gap. There aren't any binding commitments or a global strategy to support affected workers.
And what about countries that are especially vulnerable to climate change, like small island nations or the least developed countries? How does the agreement address their needs?
A major outcome was the operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund. It's designed to provide financial support to countries hit hardest by climate disasters. There's also a push to increase climate finance for adaptation and for access to clean energy technology.
But the initial funding for that Loss and Damage Fund was limited, right?
Yes, that's been a central criticism, especially from vulnerable nations. The agreement does call for reforms to the international financial system to better support them, but concrete ways to guarantee enough funding are still being negotiated.
So, stepping back, what does this agreement actually mean on a global scale?
It's a political signal. For many, it marks the start of the end for the fossil fuel era. It sets a new benchmark for global climate ambition, even if it isn't legally enforceable.
Future talks will need to close some big gaps, like binding commitments and stronger support for workers and vulnerable countries. But right now, this is a step the world hadn't taken before.
And it's a reminder that government agreements are just one part. Businesses and individuals have roles to play too. This transition involves everyone.
So that's the story. A clear call to move away from fossil fuels, a first in these climate talks, with important implications for energy, economies, and the planet.
Thanks for joining us as we explored the details and challenges of what came out of COP28.
Thank you for listening. This episode was brought to you by mynews.studio. Try it now for free.